Section 4.2 Interactive Assignment Objective 3. And so for this question it says, consider the data set given in the table. We want to complete parts A through D. Okay, so in part A, they want us to determine the least squares regression line and then choose the correct answer below. Now in order to do that, we're going to go ahead and click on the data, and then we're going to open this up into StatCrunch. Okay, so here's the data. We have our X column, there's our values for X, there's our values for Y. And so what we're going to do is we want to figure out what is the regression line. So I'm going to go ahead and select Stat, I'm going to go to Regression, and I'm going to select Simple Linear. Okay, so I want to make sure my X variable is listed as X, our Y variable is Y. Okay, and then we're probably going to be looking at the graph here. So we're going to fit the line plot, which is what we want. And then down here, I'm just going to go ahead and select horizontal and vertical. So let me go ahead and select compute. Now when I select compute, I'm going to go ahead and copy this so we can see what we're looking for to get this equation. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this information onto my sheet here. Okay, so let's take a look at this information here. So what we're looking for is the following. Okay, we want to find out, okay, what is the equation in part A? Because that's what we're looking for. And if you look here, we have the intercept and the slope. Okay, and then recall that our equation is y, which is going to equal the slope. Remember, the slope is b1 times x, and then plus the y-intercept, which is b0. So if you take a look here, we know that our slope is given here at 2.1. So that means we have 2.1x. Let me go ahead and correct that. 2.1x plus the y-intercept, which is 1.2. Okay, so this gives us our equation that we're given in part A. So let's go back and then answer this question. Okay, so here we can see that the least squares regression line is y is equal to 2.1x plus 2. Okay, now the next question says they want us to graph the least squares regression line on a scatter diagram and then choose the correct graph below. So here we want to check out, okay, which one of these graphs is it going to represent? So if we go back to StatCrunch, okay, and over here we're going to go to the right. And then having those grid lines allows us to be able to see the points a little more clearly. So in the center here, if you notice right in the middle, that is the origin where it's 0, 0. And then to the left of this point, to the left of the origin is going to be -1. So our value for x is 0. Excuse me, the value of x is -1, and the value of y is 0. So that's -1, 0. And you can see here that our line doesn't go through that point. So let's take a look at part A. Well, we can see that that point doesn't exist in part A. It does exist in part B, but it's going through that point, and we don't want that because we know that the graph, okay, is not going through that point. Likewise over here, it's also going through that point. So therefore, we're not going to choose C. Now, if we look at the data values here, and then we can go ahead and open this up a little clearly, then we can see what this graph and how it is compared to that. So we can see, comparing this graph to this graph, that it's going to be part D. Okay? So now we have the graph. Now in part C, it says the equation of the line that's containing -2, -4, and 2, 5 is given by the equation y equals 2.25x plus 0.5. And what they want us to do is compute the sum of the squared residuals of the given data set for this line. So here's our line in part C. So I'm going to go back to our table here, or our information. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close out of this so that we can now start using this information here. So again, in part C, all right, we're given the following equations. Let me go ahead and rewrite that again. So it's 2.25x plus 0.5. So it's y, which is equal to 2.25x plus 0.5. Okay, so this is the equation that's given. All right. Now we want to be able to compute the sum of the residuals. So in order to do that, we need to create a table. Okay, so we want to make sure that we have a correct table here. So looking at the table here, we have our first column. Our first column represents x. And our values for x, we put in -2, -1, 0, 1, and then 2. Okay, and then our next column is going to be y. So that column is going to represent -4, 0, 2, 3, and 5. Okay, now the next column, what it's going to represent is the part C equation. So recall up here that there's the equation, and you can see here it's y, which is equal to 2.25x plus 0.5. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to plug in each value in for x into the equation. So the value for x is -2, and we're going to plug it into the equation. So we're going to take 2.25 times -2 plus 0.5, and that's going to give us the value of -4. Okay, next we're going to plug in the next x value of -1. So we're going to plug in -1 into the equation. 2.25 times -1 plus 0.5 is going to give us a value of -1.75. Okay, next, the next value of x is 0. 2.25 times 0 is 0, and then plus 0.5 gives us 0.5. The next value for x is 1, so we're going to take 1, plug it into the equation. 2.25 times 1 plus 0.5 gives us 2.75. Okay, and then the last x value is 2. So plug in 2 into the equation. 2.25 times 2 plus 0.5 gives us 5. Okay, now the next column, what we want to do is we want to find the residual. And the residual is taking the y value and then subtracting the value that we got for the equation here. So what we're doing is now we're taking the y value of -4, and then we're going to subtract the value of -4. So that becomes -4 plus 4, which then gives us 0. Okay, next, we're going to take our next y value of 0, and then we're going to subtract what we got in that last column. So we're minusing -1.75, which is the same thing as adding 1.75, and that gives us plus 1.75. Okay, next, we're going to take the next y value of 2. So we're going to take that y value of 2, and then we're going to subtract the 0.5, and that gives us 1.5 as a residual. Next, we're going to take the y value of 3, and then we're going to subtract what we got in that last column of 2.75, which gives us 0.25. And then we're going to take the y value of 5, and then we're going to subtract what we got, which was 5, and that gives us 0. And that gives us 0. Okay. Now we're going to take each residual, and then we're going to square it. So in the next column, we're going to take each residual and then square it. So we're going to take 0 squared, and that's going to give us 0. And then we're going to take 1.5, square it, and that's going to give us 3.0625. And then we're going to take 1.5, the residual, and square that, and that gives us 2.25. We're going to take the residual of 0.25 and square it to give us oops, let me go ahead and change that color there. It's going to give us 0.0625, and need to change that again. And then the last one, we take the residual of 0, squaring it, and that gives us a total of 0. Now, what we want to do is we want to add this entire column. So when we add all these numbers up, we get the sum of the residual squared, which is 5.375. Now, going back to our question, the sum of the squared residuals for the line containing the points is 5.375. Okay, now in part D, it says compute the sum of the squared residuals of the given data set for the least squares regression line that we found in part A. Well, the regression line in part A was 2.1x plus 1.2. Okay, so we're now going to go back to our table, And now we're going to create a new column using the equation in part A, which is 2.1x plus 1.2. And we're going to follow the same steps. So we're going to take our x value of -2, we're going to plug it into the equation. So 2.1 times -2 plus 1.2 gives us a value of -3. Next, we're going to take our next x value, which is -1, plug it into the equation. 2.1 times -1 plus 1.2 gives us a value of -0.9. Again, we're going to take the value of x, which is 0, times 2.1 plus 1.2, and that's going to give us positive 1.2. Again, we're going to take the value of x, which is 1, plug it into the equation. 1 times 2.1 plus 1.2 is going to give us a value of 3.3. And then again, we're going to take the value of 2, which is the value of x, multiply by 2.1 and add 1.2 to get 5.4. Okay, next, now we're going to create another column. We're going to take our y values over here, and then we're going to subtract what we got in this column. So the y values, okay, is -4, and then we're subtracting the -3. So that means -4 plus 3 is going to give us -1 as a residual. Again, we're going to take the y value now of 0, and then we are going to subtract what we got in the previous column. So minus -0.9 is the same thing as plus 0.9, and that gives us positive 0.9. Next, we're going to take the value of the y value of 2, subtract what we got in that previous column of 1.2 to give us 0.8. Again, we're going to take the next y value of 3, and then we're going to subtract what we got in the previous column of 3.3, and that gives us -0.3. And then the last y value is 5, and then we're going to subtract what we got in the previous column of 5.4, and when we subtract that, we get -0.4. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and then do like we did in the previous one. So we're going to take the residual and square it. So -1 squared gives us positive 1. 0.9 squared gives us 0.81. 0.8 squared gives us 0.64. -0.3 squared gives us 0.09. And -0.4 squared gives us 0.16. Okay, now, just like we did in that previous example here, we're going to add up the total column for the residuals here, and we get the value of 2.7. So then back into our question here, we come back here, the sum of the squared residuals for the least squares regression line is 2.7, and that completes this question.